92.1 WROI, WROIFM.com on a Thursday morning. And we're pleased to be welcome to the studio this morning, former United States Congressman and Senator Joe Donnelly. Senator, good morning.
Thanks so much for having me with you today.
Hey, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, it was really nice on the way down to see that most everything is planted now.
Finally.
Finally.
It has been a while.
It has been a real tough slog, but most everything's in it.
Yeah, we've chatted that Indiana was probably the last state in the Midwest to get all the crops in this year because of the rains.
Yeah, it's been a wet year.
It has been a very wet year, so we'll hope things dry out and the crops are good this year because ag is still a huge industry in our state.
It is, and I see prices have started to go up a little bit, and I think part of that was anticipation of all of the rain and similar things. Yeah. But it'd be great to get back to normal on prices and other things at some point.
When I introduced you, I said Congressman, former United States Senator, and I'm kind of curious as to, we know what the obvious differences are between being a congressman and a senator, but from the inside perspective of someone who has done both, what are the challenges? What are the differences? Well,
I said in kind of an offhanded manner that the Senate is kind of like the refined, quiet club, and the House of Representatives is like the all-night truck stop on the interstate. But what they really are like is one's you have to cover an entire state, so hopefully what happens is everybody becomes more measured as opposed to partisan. What happens with congressional districts a lot is they're much more partisan, and so you have members that go to Congress that come with a more partisan point of view. And so the Senate is actually what our role has always been to play, and I hope will be played in the future, is to kind of cool things down a little bit when some harebrained ideas, if you get just enough to get a majority and you're going to change this or you're going to change that. Well, we've done pretty well for hundreds of years with the system we have.
Yes, we have.
Stand athwart history and say, stop and take a breath for a minute, folks.
That's right.
Now, on the other hand, when you talked about the partisanship in the House, a lot of that's got to do with gerrymandering, doesn't it?
It does.
And you've been impacted by that because, while my congressional district has changed sizes and shapes so many times, it's not even funny, but that ends up generating partisanship, doesn't it?
Well, sure. Our district used to be much closer toward about 50-50
right.
in our congressional area. And what happens when it's closer to 50-50 is you usually get policies that are much more 50-50 that you have to listen to everybody. But over the years, that changes. Every 10 years, lines change, and so they're going to change again after 2020. And what I've said for a long, long time is it ought to be, instead of the politicians drawing the lines, in effect, figuring out what's best for business, your own personal business. What's a lot better is for citizens to do it, whether it is the local schools that figure it out or local community groups that figure it out. You get a much better result. They do that in Iowa, and almost every district is 50-50.
One of the Democrats running for president, that's their idea, isn't it? To try to do that?
Right. They talk about that a lot. I've always thought that made sense. I had asked the Indiana legislature on numerous occasions, look, why don't we make this a nonpartisan commission that chooses where the lines are going to be? And then you have something that's much more reflective of our state in the legislature.
Now, is this something that would have to be done state by state, or absent a constitutional amendment, can the federal government mandate anything to do with elections?
Well, it is all state by state, and you see there are certain restrictions on the federal level that they have to be, they can't be racially biased, that they can't be packed one way or the other. But overall, it's state by state. Yeah.
Are you surprised that Indiana has become as red a state as what it has over the last 5 years or so?
I wouldn't say surprised. It is something that I hope that everybody keeps an open mind in our state. President Trump is very popular here, and the campaign that was run by Hillary Clinton, in terms of its effect and its ability and its success was basically horrible on every front. I talked to them on numerous occasions about things I thought made more sense for their campaign, And it was like talking to my son when he was in 10th grade. And he had one opinion about what to do. And when I tell him he's not going to the party, he told me exactly what he thought of me. So, I think that, history has pendulums. What has happened, too, is there's been more of an urban-rural divide, which is a bad thing for our country. When we're all in this together, look, our farmers have incredible economic interests that they really need both sides to look out for. That we have to make sure that when we get into tariff fights, don't make it that our farmers are the targets of these. In urban areas, we have to make sure that every child can get a good education. And so there's not urban issues and rural issues to the exclusion of one another. We're one America, and when we work together, we're stronger.
I have noticed that people who will complain about somebody else somewhere getting something that they think they paid for, once you make it universal, kind of goes away. Social Security was universal.
Right.
Medicare was universal. If we had universal education, people wouldn't be agitating and getting mad about affirmative action because anybody that qualified could get into a state school. Now, this is not just, but on the other hand, you got some we were talking about Democratic presidential candidates that seem to want to take that to a great extent. But is this something that the party could work on to say, instead of I've got this program for these people that live over here, I got this program that everybody can take part in?
Whenever I was asked about free college, I would say, well, don't they pay for the lights? Don't they pay for the professors? So it's not free. Somebody pays.
Right.
And so what we need to do is make it as accessible as possible.
Right.
And then we have to make sure that in our high school levels, we have programs for young people that, whether they're at Rochester or Tippy Valley or at Caston or at Plymouth High School, that they know, look, if college is not the thing that's for me, there's great training for skills programs like becoming the best electrician or carpenter or the military. And so what we have to do is be able to show there's a path for success to all of you and give them hope and opportunity. But the other part about college is if you say it's all free, it kind of devalues what it is, that you don't want people coming out with $100,000 in debt. But at the same time, you want them to know this is something special that you've had the chance to obtain. And, you can work a little bit at night, or you can do this or do that and have that opportunity.
Since we're talking about politics, does this 2020 campaign remind you of 2016 only in reverse? with a lot of Democrats and one Republican, as opposed to what we have before?
It does in that way. I keep looking for the Democrat who's coming down the escalator at Trump Tower. Hasn't arrived yet.
Who's that going to be?
I don't know. I will tell you, Mayor Pete's done a great job, from South Bend, and he brings a new perspective. This is going to be something that works its way out, as we move forward. Joe Biden is somebody that I know very, very well, who has...
you worked with him in the Senate.
I worked with him in the Senate. As vice president, we worked together on a lot of things. We worked together on a lot of anti-terrorism efforts and other things. He shows great judgment also. But this is going to be a marathon. And, I just think that the more you're out there and tested, the better you become and the better you understand this nation. That in Northwest Iowa, you have large farm communities that you have to talk to. In downtown Des Moines, you have urban areas that you have to talk to. And the same for Indiana. And by talking to everybody, you better understand this nation.
Is it fair to ask this question? How is the mayor of South Bend qualified to be president of the United States?
Well, we'll see how that question is answered as we move forward.
Well, the Constitution lays out the qualification. Constitution tells you what the qualification is.
Sure, right. It basically is just an age qualification.
He's certainly qualified for that. And, the thing he talks about as well is, look, he served in Afghanistan and, has been on the front lines there outside the wire. He has dealt with, a number of issues as mayor. And so the people are going to decide that as we look at it.
Let's talk about that because Barron mentioned yesterday the president sending some troops, 1,000 troops back to the Middle East. Is this just a continual ongoing thing? I mean, are we always going to see this in our lifetime? Is there any way that we can extricate ourselves from that situation?
Well, the reason I voted for the Iran agreement was that it gave us 15 years where they could not continue producing nuclear enriched material. So we had at least, it provided 10 years of that and also guaranteed that they would never, ever, ever get a bomb. And so that was the underpinning of the agreement. And with every agreement, each side gets a little bit. I mean, that's how you set the price on an advertisement.
Right.
That's how you do anything. And so some folks said, well, we wish they didn't get this and we wish they didn't get that. And I said, I understand, but in return, we have 10 years where our young men and women are not going there, are not going to face potential situations. And so I am hopeful in regards to Iran that this will start to cool down. But make no mistake, Iran is not Iraq. Iran has 75 million people. They have extraordinary technologies, and it's a dangerous situation, and we have to be careful. I can understand why these soldiers are being sent at this time. It's just that we need to make sure we don't wind up on a path where young men and women from Rochester and Terre Haute's lives are at stake in a situation that it didn't have to be that way.
You're not going to drive to Tehran in a week.
Oh, no.
You are not going to have a war in Iran like you had in Iraq.
No.
And it's going to be a war like you haven't seen since the 1950s in Korea. I mean, that's what I am being told by people who have been in combat. And I want to ask you I want to get to real politics for just 1 second. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon as long as Vladimir Putin doesn't want them to. And the minute he wants them to, they'll have 3 under their bed.
Well,
and I think everybody on Earth knows that.
Well, I will tell you this. Our intelligence services are really good. And we have.
Well, see, that's another issue we have, isn't it? Because we've been told how they're nothing but a big, bad, deep state that don't do anything right.
Well, all I can tell you is this. I know our intelligence folks. I know how hard they work. I know what a great job they do. And I know that they're pretty sharp on Iran. And so we have a pretty good handle on what is going on there. And they are still today, before the agreement was signed, they were within 1 year of having a nuclear weapon. As of today, they are 10 years away. We hope it stays closer to 10 than to 1. That's the goal.
Well, if they get that nuclear weapon, then that changes the whole balance of power in the Middle East.
No.
The stated policy is that they'll never get one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't believe that they will.
Does Russia want them to have one?
You know, you'd have to ask Vladimir Putin.
Because the thing is, Pakistan gave one to North Korea, basically, and Pakistan is pretty much closer to Iran than they are North Korea. This is what I keep out. I'm not trying to be snarky.
No.
I'm just saying, if somebody decides in Tehran we're going to have a nuclear weapon, I don't know how we stop that from happening.
Well, I can tell you
maybe
that,
building one, but somebody can give
that
them
our
one.
intelligence forces are incredible, that our knowledge of what goes on in the area is really, really strong, and that we've made a commitment as a nation because of the incredible danger it would create. We've made a commitment as a nation to never allow them to have nuclear weapons, and that's not Democrat, that's not Republican, that's just our national policy. And it will be followed.
Is their capability being damaged by all the attacks that are sent their way by people in our government? Because it's not just the president, it's people in Congress and the Senate, too. Every time the intelligence agencies say something they don't like, well, they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, our intelligence agencies actually just get better every day, and their capabilities are incredible. And all that noise you hear out of the House and the Senate and the president or the executive branch, banging on the intelligence agencies, that's kind of like, everybody who's sitting at the diner telling the farmers how to plant their crop. The farmers know how to plant their crop.
92.1 WROI speaking this morning with Senator Joe Donnelly on WROI. And, of course, as we, talk about world situations, you did a lot of traveling while you were senator overseas.
I did. I was very fortunate serving on the Armed Services Committee to work closely with our military I was in Iraq about 5 or 6 times, Afghanistan 5 or 6 times, Pakistan numerous occasions, and whatever you see in Pakistan one day is not necessarily what you see there the next day. And to be in Israel and throughout the region, and so it's really important to me that we get this right.
Are we going to get it right?
I think that we see in big parts of the Middle East that, for instance, Syria, we really had a shot to get that right, and that falls on both President Obama and the executive office now. That we could have had no-fly zones. We could have had
you were talking about
safe
that,
right?
zones. Yeah,
Right.
I was one of the leaders on that, and what that would have done is the other thing that happened is because there's such turmoil in Syria, everybody left, and it created the migrant problem that you saw throughout
Right.
Europe. And what I always said with a safe zone is, if you compare it to the United States, it would be like people from Indiana just waiting in Ohio till things got straightened out. And where do people want to go from Indiana? Do they want to go to Ohio, or do they want to go to Venezuela? They want to go to Ohio. And so if we had done that, we would have been in a better situation. Syria is very dangerous, but the Middle East as a whole, there's so many different hotspots. It could pop up anywhere at any time. Iran is a significant concern. But you have folks like the Russians and the Chinese as well.
Let's bring it a little closer to home if we can,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I'm curious about this. With President Obama had begun to open up the the country of Cuba. President Trump has kind of shut that down. Where do we stand with Cuba now?
Well, things have kind of slowed down in terms of reconnecting with Cuba. I always thought it made sense because it would have been great for our farmers.
Sure.
Cuba is a huge consumer of pork, of corn, of all of those products, and we had great relationships being started. And I've always felt that our ideas as a country, when we live up to them, are so strong that the whole world looks to us as the beacon. And so I can promise you that in Cuba, everybody looks towards the United States as their dream,
Sure.
as the place when they say, if you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be? It is the United States. And so our ideas are so powerful here when we lay them out that our ideas overcome problems in other countries. That's why things like in Germany, the Berlin Wall fell down. And when you talk to them and engage with them, you get much better results.
I've always been surprised that over the centuries we didn't do more with Cuba in terms of not necessarily making it a state, but a protectorate or something along that line. But it just seems like it never happened.
And it would have made so much sense.
I think so. 90 miles off our coast, for heaven's sakes.
Absolutely.
They hadn't handed it over to the 5 families after World War II, Castro never would have came along.
Right.
That scene in Godfather 2 is true. Literally, the 5 families in New York were running Cuba after World War II.
Well, I am still hopeful in regards to Cuba. I think that this may be a blip in terms of lack of coordination and trying to bring them in effect along to just like the other Caribbean nations
Right.
that are out there, and that we have trade. It's going to happen. It's just a question of when. What's interesting is I was at the Midwest League All-Star game the other night, and a young man who was playing, they put up hometown Havana, Cuba,
Wow.
and I thought he got out a few years ago.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. Wow.
And he was a good ball
too young
player
even
too.
for the Mariel boat lift or anything. So
Senator, 50 years ago, we walked on the moon. You, of course,
Incredible.
had experience through Congress and the Senate to watch NASA over the years and see where we are. What do you think?
I think that I think we're coming back in
Okay.
NASA, and I think one of the neat things that we have too is that, for instance, Elon Musk has a company, SpaceX,
yeah,
and they're doing things.
they put a car in space.
They're doing wild and crazy things with engines and rockets, and that's great. Jeff Bezos at Amazon has a company, Blue Origin, and they're competing with Elon Musk, and so we're developing all kinds of different rocket engines. I think we're going to be heading back to the moon, and then maybe someday to Mars.
Something that's come up again, at least that I've seen in the news, that we saw a bit in the 1980s. Apparently, the Chinese are starting to weaponize space. Is this something we need to start worrying about again? Because, I mean, I can remember all those arguments back in the 1980s, with Star Wars and stuff. But, the Chinese are putting things into orbit that really only have a military utility to them.
Well, there's some subjects I can't talk to you about.
See, I was going to ask you about Area 51 or 54 or whatever it is.
That would, in fact, be one of the areas I cannot talk to you about.
Oh, man.
I mean, it's. I think it's like the priesthood. Once you're...
Exactly. Confession, right. Exactly.
You mentioned Venezuela. That was big in the news for about 5 minutes, and then suddenly nobody's talking about it again. But in general, overall, what's going on in South America? I mean, 2 entire countries lost all their electrical power the other night. Why can't,
Oh, and Venezuela has more oil per capita, I think,
see,
than
that's
any
the other
place
thing.
in the
They
world.
have all these resources.
It's the way the country's run, and hopefully at some point they can get it straightened out and get it figured out, and that the people of Venezuela deserve so much more. If Venezuela was run like Indiana or was run like Ohio,
they'd be a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
They'd have more money than any place in the world. Yeah. Absolutely.
We saw demonstrations there. We recently saw demonstrations in Hong Kong. And maybe this goes back to what you were alluding to earlier, that the principles of the United States, the thought processes are very strong in the world today.
Yeah, when people of the world, for all those years when I was serving, I would be in Ukraine, for instance.
Right.
And when I was there, people would come up and say, the United States is the only reason the Russians haven't invaded our country, because they know you're our friend. And what we want to do is become like you. In Israel, they'd say, look, we fight with you all the time, but it's like a brother and sister fighting. That when push comes to shove, we know we're in this together. And countries around the world, when we live up to all of our hopes and aspirations here, we are that shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan talked about.
Okay.
And we can always be that. But we have to take responsibility. We have to, there's no free lunch. We have to pay our bills. We have to do all of these things, because when we do that, we're also going to be finding the cure for cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes and muscular dystrophy, and money that's being used to pay. And this is another story for another day, but money that we're using right now to pay the interest rate on the money we borrowed could all be used to cure cancer.
Yeah.
And that's what we should be doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
exactly.
Thank you for having me with you today. I
Thank
really
you so much
appreciate
for
it.
being here. And what are you doing now?
So I'm teaching at Notre Dame.
Okay.
And
Like science or something, maybe political science, perhaps.
Probably not physics. That would be really bad. Then they'd have the worst physics department in America. But public policy and national security.
Okay.
And, so I've had the blessing to do that. I'm practicing law as well. I practiced law before I became a member of Congress. And just being with my family. It's been great. Yeah.
Good.
And so, like this morning, I drove down, checked out the crops, saw how they were doing, checked the prices online, and because agriculture is very close to my heart.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
All right.
Well,
Senator,
thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator.
And this is the year that the Colts win the Super Bowl again, right?
Very good.
Multiple Lombardis.
We're going for it. We're going for it.
When it comes to baseball, though, Cincinnati's a city on the Ohio River. That's all. It is 7:26 at 92.1 WROI, and we are going to get back into our regular programming right now.
Pete died.